Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7.
Today we aren't just opening a can of worms, we are walking straight into a theological minefield.
We really are. We're tackling, the single most explosive contradiction in religious history. It's the ultimate clash.
It really is.
On one side, you have the modern idea of an omnipotent, loving, gracious God. And then on the other, you have these ancient texts where that same God explicitly commands the complete obliteration of entire nations.
Yeah.
We're talking about a God who says, love your neighbor, but also seems to say, wipe them out.
And we should be crystal clear from the jump. We aren't talking about soldiers fighting soldiers on a battlefield.
Yeah.
We're analyzing texts that command the destruction of women, children, infants, even the livestock. It's the definition of a scorched earth policy.
It is the question that, keeps believers awake at night and gives atheists their sharpest ammunition. To get to the bottom of this, we're analyzing a high-stakes debate between Alex O'Connor, a brilliant philosophical skeptic and atheist,
Yep.
and a father-son duo of Christian apologists, Cliff and Stuart Neckel.
It's a collision of two completely different operating systems. You have O'Connor acting as the prosecution, arguing that these texts describe what the United Nations would legally define today as genocide.
Right.
And then you have the Neckels for the defense, arguing for, well, historical nuance, hyperbole, and a definition of justice that is, frankly, very alien to our modern Western ears.
So the mission for this deep dive is to unpack this trial. We aren't here to declare a winner.
Yeah.
We're here to look at the evidence they presented, the history, the ugly reality of the text, and the philosophical trap that snaps shut halfway through the debate. But hey, before we crack open those case files, I have a quick request. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives going and allows us to tackle these difficult, controversial topics.
So let's start with the prosecution. What is the core of O'Connor's argument against the Old Testament God?
He doesn't pull any punches. He goes straight to the primary source material.
Yeah.
He argues that you cannot logically claim God is loving and merciful when he issues commands to exterminate everyone that breathes.
Okay.
He zooms right in on the city of Ai in the book of Joshua.
Right. Joshua chapter 8. This is where the rubber meets the road.
The text says 12,000 people fell that day. But O'Connor flags the specific phrasing. It says men and women. And after the opposing soldiers are drawn out and killed in the field, the Israelites are commanded to go back into the city to finish off whoever's left.
Which implies the non-combatants, the
Yeah.
elderly, the infirm, the people hiding in their homes.
Exactly. O'Connor's point is that this isn't collateral damage. Collateral damage is tragic, but it's unintended. This is targeted. It's intentional. And he doubles down with the Amalekites in 1 Samuel. The command there is, it's chilling. Do not spare them. It lists men, women, children, infants, cattle, sheep, camels, donkeys. Kill them all.
The inclusion of the animals always throws people. It just feels so excessive. Why the donkeys? Why the sheep?
That's part of the horror O'Connor highlights. It represents total erasure. And there is this specific incident with King Saul regarding this command that really drives the point home.
Yeah.
Saul goes to war, he wins, but he decides to spare the opposing king, Agag, and he keeps some of the best livestock.
Maybe to sacrifice to God later, or, maybe for plunder.
Right, but what's God's reaction? He's furious. He regrets making Saul king. O'Connor argues that God didn't punish Saul for murder. He punished Saul for not murdering enough. He failed to carry out the full extent of the extermination.
That is a brutal framing.
But it's the text. O'Connor's logic is that if a modern government did this, cleared a land, killed non-combatants, killed the animals, we wouldn't call it war. We would call it ethnic cleansing or genocide. He's holding the text to the Geneva Convention, essentially.
Which brings us to the defense. How do Cliff and Stuart Neckel even respond to a charge that severe? Because on the surface, the text does seem to say exactly what O'Connor is claiming.
This is where we get into the defense of hyperbole. Cliff Neckel introduces this idea of ancient Near Eastern hyperbole.
Right. This is a common theological argument, but it often sounds like a cop-out to the average listener.
It does, exactly. So Cliff uses a sports analogy to make it stick. He says, imagine a high school football team on a Friday night. They're all psyched up and they're shouting, we're going to kill them this weekend.
Oh.
Or we're going to slaughter them.
Okay, now if you're an alien or maybe an archaeologist from 2,000 years in the future digging up a locker room tape, you might think, my God, they are planning a massacre.
Precisely. But in context, everyone knows it just means total victory. It's trash talk. It's war rhetoric. The argument is that the ancient Near East spoke in these massive exaggerations.
But here's the problem with that defense. Is there actual evidence for it in the Bible? Or is this just a convenient way to say God didn't really mean it?
They claim the evidence is right there in the text. They point out that in the very next books of the Bible, the people groups who were supposedly utterly destroyed and wiped out, they show up again. They're still there.
So, literally speaking, they couldn't have been totally obliterated.
Right. If chapter 1 says we killed everyone, and chapter 2 says then we fought the survivors, then everyone obviously didn't mean everyone. It meant we won decisively.
That is a fair point regarding consistency. If
Yeah.
you take the kill them all literally, you have to explain the survivors.
And then they pivot to archaeology. They talk about Jericho. The popular image is this massive city with, schools and hospitals and civilians everywhere. But the Nechtals argue that Jericho was likely a smaller fortress, a military outpost guarding the countryside.
So the people inside were primarily soldiers, government officials, maybe some support staff.
Mostly. I mean, they acknowledge Rahab the prostitute was there, so there were some non-combatants. But the argument is that these were military targets, fortifications protecting the land, rather than big civilian population centers.
Okay, so that softens the blow of genocide by reframing it as military victory against a fortified position. But, and there's always a but, even if it was a fortress, and even if it was hyperbole, surely some innocents died.
That's the question that just refuses to go away. You can minimize the numbers, you can call it a fortress, but O'Connor presses them hard on this. He asks, do you believe innocent children were killed by Israelites on God's command?
And how do they answer that? You can't really say no if you read the text.
They don't say no. They pivot to a discussion about collectivism versus individualism. And honestly, this is where the cultural gap between us and the ancient world gets really wide.
Unpack that for us, because to a modern ear, collectivism just sounds like punishing people for crimes they didn't commit.
Well, we in the West are hyper-individualists. I am responsible for me, you are responsible for you. But the ancient Near East was collectivist. The group, the tribe, the family unit was like one single organism.
Okay,
The Nechtals use the analogy of an alcoholic parent.
I see where this is going.
If a parent is an alcoholic, the children suffer. The children didn't buy the drink, they didn't choose the addiction, but they bear the consequences of the parents' decisions. The argument is that these nations, the Canaanites, the Amalekites, had been living in wickedness for hundreds of years.
And we should clarify, when the Bible says wickedness, it's not talking about, jaywalking.
Yeah.
The historical sources mention things like child sacrifice and temple prostitution.
Yes, detestable practices. So the argument is the parents' refusal to repent, their insistence on this violent culture, brought judgment down on the whole body, which tragically includes the children.
It's the idea of ripple effects. Decisions have consequences that stretch down through generations. Cliff even brings up modern warfare to make this point relatable, doesn't he?
He does. He mentions things like Desert Storm or Israeli bombs hitting Gaza. He says we're naive if we think we can go to war and no innocents will die. He frames it not as God maliciously targeting kids, but as a tragic, inevitable result of a cursed, messed up world where human sin, in this case the sin of the Canaanite nations, brings about destruction.
But there is a theological safety net here, isn't there? Because for a secular humanist like O'Connor, a dead child is the ultimate tragedy. End of story. The light just goes out.
Right. And this is crucial for the apologists' defense. They believe that any child who dies before the age of accountability goes to heaven. So while the physical death is tragic and violent, they argue that God isn't separating these children from himself eternally.
I see.
In their view, the justice of God ultimately triumphs because those victims are with him.
Which changes the calculus completely if you accept that premise. It doesn't make the violence less bloody, but it removes the eternal cruelty aspect of it.
But let's zoom out a bit. We're talking about the killing, the children, the war.
Yeah.
But the debate also touches on the who. Who has the right to order this?
The creator's prerogative.
The Nechtals argue that God gave these nations 400 years, 4 centuries, to turn things around. They weren't just minding their own business. They were sacrificing children to idols. God, as the creator, eventually says, enough.
But O'Connor spots a double standard here, right? He points out that Israel wasn't exactly perfect either.
Oh, absolutely. He says, look, Israel was sinful. They fell into idolatry constantly. Why do they get a land and a prophet while the Canaanites get the sword?
That is a strong point. It feels like favoritism.
Yeah.
Like God is just picking a winning team.
But the expert Stuart Nettle, this time, pushes back. He says, no, God judged Israel too. When Israel fell into the same sins child sacrifice, idolatry, God didn't let them off the hook. He sent the Assyrians and the Babylonians to crush them, to destroy their temple, to exile them.
So the argument is God plays no favorites. Sin equals judgment, whether you're the chosen people or the Canaanites.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really philosophical. And honestly, this is a bit of a trap that the apologist set for O'Connor. This is the part that really highlights the clash between atheism and theism.
The moral argument.
Yes, O'Connor identifies as a moral anti-realist.
We need to pause and define that. For the listener, moral anti-realism generally means he doesn't believe that moral values are, like, objective facts woven into the universe like gravity or math. He thinks morality is subjective, socially constructed, maybe evolutionary.
Right, so the apologists pounce on this. They ask, effectively, if there is no God and no objective morality, on what basis are you saying this genocide is wrong?
That is the classic Lincoln defense. If this isn't wrong, nothing is wrong.
Exactly. They create this paradox. The skeptic is condemning God for being immoral, using a standard of good and evil. But the apologist argues that without God, those standards are just opinions. They're just biological impulses. So O'Connor is in the awkward position of saying, I don't believe objective evil exists, but this God is objectively evil.
It's a fascinating philosophical pivot. It shifts the burden from, is God good, to how do you define good without God? It forces the atheist to borrow from a theistic worldview the idea of objective human rights to attack theism.
It's a brilliant maneuver. But I want to circle back to the violence itself. Because even with hyperbole, even with the philosophy, the text describes something very specific. A ban on everything. Why the animals? Why the total destruction?
The fear of contamination. This is the concept of holiness. And the expert explains that holiness in the Bible means separation.
Separation from what?
From anything that could pull Israel back into idolatry. The argument is that if anything remained, even the livestock, even the people who might seduce them into other religions, Israel would assimilate. It's a slippery slope argument.
And history suggests they were right to be worried, frankly.
That's the irony. Israel didn't fully clear them out. They did intermarry. They did start worshiping other gods, and eventually their entire nation collapsed because of it. So the apologists argue that the harshness of the command was a desperate measure to prevent spiritual infection.
It sounds almost like a surgeon removing a cancer. You have to get it all or it comes back.
That is exactly the metaphor they are going for.
But Stewart makes a very important distinction here. He calls this a theocracy.
Yes, and this is vital for anyone worried about religious violence today. Stewart argues that this was a one-time, unique historical moment. God was carving out a specific land for a specific purpose, to bring the Messiah into the world.
So this isn't a precedent for just war.
No. They explicitly say this is not an example of just war theory. We do not live in a theocracy today. The U.S. is not a theocracy. The U.K. is not a theocracy. Therefore, no one today can claim God told me to wipe out my neighbors. That authority just doesn't exist anymore.
That is a relief, at least. But there's another point they made that I found honestly shocking. It was about the alternative to death.
Oh, the gracious death argument. This is a hard one to swallow.
It stopped me in my tracks. They suggested that in the ancient Near East, if you were conquered, you weren't just killed. You were often enslaved, tortured, flayed alive, or the women were mass raped for the rest of their lives.
It's a brutal reality of ancient history. We tend to sanitize the past, but it was a horror show.
It was. And they floated the idea that putting to the sword, a quick death, might have actually been a more gracious fate than the alternative of that specific era. It's a dark thought, but it contextualizes just how brutal the ancient world was, regardless of who was fighting.
And all of this, the separation, the harshness, the land, it all drives toward one goal for them, doesn't it?
Exclusive for the sake of inclusive. That's the phrase.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning that God had to be exclusively focused on this one tiny group of people, the Israelites.
Yeah.
Protecting their lineage, protecting their theology, keeping them distinct from everyone else. Why?
Yeah.
Not just to be mean to the neighbors, but so that eventually, through that line, Jesus could be born.
So the logic is you need the hard shell to protect the seed.
Right. And Jesus, in their view, is the light to all nations. So the exclusion of the Canaanites was the necessary mechanism to eventually bring about the inclusion of everyone, Samaritans, Gentiles, you and me, into God's family later on.
So let's try to summarize where we've landed after digging through this debate, because these are two irreconcilable views.
On side A, the prosecution Alex O'Connor, you have the text as it reads naturally. It describes literal, divinely ordered ethnic cleansing. It kills innocence. It destroys cultures. And it challenges the very idea of a good God. It suggests that if God exists, he's a moral monster.
And on side B, the defense, the Nettles, you have a complex mix of factors. They argue it's ancient hyperbole, it's a judgment on a specifically wicked culture that refused to change, and it was a unique, one-time theocratic necessity to pave the way for a Messiah who would save the world.
And they argue that we can't judge ancient history through a 21st century Judeo-Christian lens, because ironically, the only reason we care about human rights so much today is largely because of the values that this Bible eventually produced.
It really is a paradox. We're using the fruit of the tree to judge the roots of the tree.
It is, and that's where we have to leave the evidence with you.
You know, as we close, there is a provocative thought that lingers for me. We often look for a God who is comfortable, a God who is safe, who aligns perfectly with our modern definition of pacifism and tolerance.
Right. We want a tame God. We want a mascot, not a king.
Exactly. But if we accept the apologist's view, even for a second, that God acts radically to prevent a greater spiritual disaster, it forces us to ask a hard question. Does that comfort us? Or does the idea of a deity who is willing to utilize such violent means to achieve holiness make the concept of divine love too alien for us to understand?
Is it possible to worship a God whose definition of good looks so much like what we define as war crimes?
That is the question.
And it's one you'll have to answer for yourself. Thanks for thinking deeper with us. We'll see you on the next deep dive.